If you walk through the headquarters of the International Monetary Fund in Washington today, you will see the flags of 190 nations hanging in a grand atrium of marble and glass. You will see diplomats in expensive suits speaking in hushed tones about credit tranches and structural adjustments. You will see the choreography of global finance performed with the precision of a ballet, a theater of cooperation where every nation appears to have an equal voice. But what you will not see are the chains. In the summer of 1944, the small mountain resort of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, was not just a conference venue for exhausted diplomats escaping the heat of Washington. It was the birthplace of a new world order. It was the drafting table where the architects of American power designed the most elegant financial trap in human history. It was the precise moment when debt became a weapon more powerful than any bomb ever dropped on any battlefield. The 700 delegates who gathered there from 44 nations believed they were building a system of genuine international cooperation. They believed they were creating institutions that would prevent another Great Depression, another catastrophic war, another generation sacrificed to chaos. They did not realize they were signing away the financial sovereignty of their nations. They did not understand the invisible architecture being constructed around them. This is the story of how the United States transformed from the world's largest debtor nation into its supreme creditor, the banker to all nations, the lender of last resort and first demand. It did not achieve this dominance through military conquest alone, though the guns certainly helped. It built a global system where every nation on Earth would need American dollars to survive, to trade, to exist in the modern economy. It created a world where debt was not a burden to be repaid, but a leash to be tightened whenever the debtor forgot its place. This is the hidden history of financial empire. It is the tale of how one currency conquered the planet not with soldiers, but with spreadsheets. To understand how America weaponized debt against the very nations it claimed to be saving, we must go back to the wreckage of 1945, to a world that had torn itself apart twice in 30 years. Europe lay in ruins, its ancient cities reduced to mountains of rubble, its railways twisted into abstract sculptures of destruction. The industrial heartland of Germany was a moonscape of bombed-out factories and flooded mines. The great cities of Britain and France were scarred by Luftwaffe bombs, their treasuries emptied by 6 years of total war. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people, its western territories scorched by the most brutal fighting in recorded history. The infrastructure of Western civilization had been ground into dust by a war that consumed everything in its path. But America was different. The continental United States had not been touched by a single enemy bomb. No foreign army had marched through its wheat fields or shattered its factory windows. Its industrial plants, which had been retooled for war production and expanded with wartime urgency, now stood ready to supply the entire planet with everything from tractors to toothbrushes. Its farms overflowed with grain while Europe starved. Its banks, located in the safest nation on Earth, held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, transferred there for safekeeping during the desperate years of Nazi expansion. At the end of World War II, the United States controlled roughly 50% of total global industrial output. Think about that figure. One single nation, with just 6% of the world's population, produced half of everything manufactured on the planet. This concentration of economic power was unprecedented in human history. The British Empire at its zenith, when Queen Victoria reigned over a quarter of Earth's landmass, never achieved such complete industrial dominance. The Roman Empire had conquered vast territories, but Rome had never controlled the global supply of money itself. America looked at this extraordinary moment and saw opportunity. Not merely the opportunity to rebuild the shattered world out of charity and Christian goodness, but the opportunity to redesign the entire global financial architecture in its own image. The man who understood this strategic moment most clearly was Harry Dexter White. White was not a household name then, and he is barely remembered now. He was an economist at the Treasury Department, a bureaucrat with round spectacles, and a forgettable face who could disappear into any crowd of Washington civil servants. But he was the true author of American financial hegemony, the architect who drew the blueprints for a dollar-dominated world. White had drafted his plan for the post-war monetary system years before the war ended, submitting versions to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau as early as 1942. He understood with crystal clarity that whoever controlled the rules of international finance would control the world, regardless of who had the most soldiers or the biggest bombs. His counterpart across the negotiating table was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist of the 20th century, representing a bankrupt and exhausted Britain. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods with a radical proposal that would have created genuine international balance. He wanted to establish an international currency called the banker, managed by a neutral global institution where no single nation held veto power. Under Keynes's system, no country would dominate. Surplus countries that accumulated too many reserves would be penalized just as much as deficit countries that spent beyond their means. The system would be balanced and fair, a genuine partnership among nations. White listened politely to every word Keynes said. He took careful notes. He nodded at appropriate moments. Then he crushed the idea completely. America had the gold. America had the factories. America had the soldiers and the atomic bomb. America would dictate the terms, and the terms would ensure American dominance for generations. The Bretton Woods system that emerged from those negotiations was not a system of equals meeting in common purpose. It was a pyramid with the American dollar sitting alone at the apex. Every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. The dollar alone would be convertible to gold at the guaranteed rate of $35 per ounce. The world would run on greenbacks, and Washington would control the printing press that produced them. The first weapon in America's newly forged financial arsenal was the Marshall Plan, announced to the world with fanfare and apparent generosity. When Secretary of State George Marshall delivered his famous speech at Harvard University in June 1947, it was presented as the most generous act of international charity in the history of civilization. $13 billion, an almost unimaginable sum in that era, would flow across the Atlantic to the devastated nations of Western Europe. American grain would feed the hungry. American machinery would rebuild the shattered factories. American technical expertise would restart the engines of European civilization. The newspapers called it unprecedented altruism. The history books still call it that today. But the Marshall Plan was not charity. It was a Trojan horse, beautifully wrapped in the rhetoric of freedom and reconstruction. The terms attached to the aid were carefully designed to lock European economies into permanent dependency on the American dollar. Every recipient country had to agree to open its markets to American goods, removing the tariffs and quotas that protected local industries. They had to dismantle trade barriers that had existed for centuries. They had to stabilize their currencies at exchange rates favorable to American exporters. Most critically, they had to buy American products with American money that America had lent them. The dollars never really left the United States. They merely circulated in an elegant loop. Consider the detailed mechanics of this brilliant system. France desperately needed tractors to rebuild its devastated agricultural sector. America would generously provide a loan, but the loan was denominated exclusively in dollars, not francs. France was required to use those dollars to purchase American tractors from American manufacturers in American factories employing American workers. The money flowed from the U.S. Treasury to the account of the tractor factory in Iowa, pausing only briefly in Paris to pick up French gratitude. France was left with the tractor and the debt. America was left with the gold and the political leverage. The farmer in Normandy could plow his fields, but the farmer in Iowa collected the payment. By 1952, when the Marshall Plan officially concluded, Western Europe had received approximately $12 billion in American aid. But in the exact same period, European nations had accumulated dollar-denominated liabilities that would bind them to the American financial system for decades to come. The pattern was established. The addiction had begun. They had discovered what seemed like a magic trick. With the stroke of a pen on a loan document, they could transform devastation into dependency, gratitude into obligation. The second weapon was the International Monetary Fund, the institution whose marble atrium we imagined at the beginning of this story. The IMF was technically an international institution, with member nations contributing capital to a common pool based on their economic size. But the voting structure was weighted by financial power, not by population or sovereign equality. The United States held enough votes to exercise effective veto power over every major decision. When a country faced a balance of payments crisis and could not pay its bills, it could borrow emergency funds from the IMF. But IMF loans came with conditions, and those conditions were written in Washington. These conditions were called structural adjustment programs. The phrase sounds technical and neutral, like a mechanic adjusting the timing on an engine. But the adjustments were anything but neutral. They required borrowing nations to cut government spending on social programs. They mandated the privatization of state-owned industries, often at fire sale prices. They demanded the elimination of trade barriers that protected local businesses from overwhelming foreign competition. They insisted that economies be opened completely to foreign investment. The conditions were presented as sound economic medicine, the tough but necessary treatment that would restore fiscal health. But the medicine always seemed to benefit American banks and American corporations first. A country in crisis would be forced to sell off its national assets at a fraction of their true value. American and European investors would swoop in with dollar-denominated funds and purchase the best pieces of the national patrimony. Airlines, telecommunications networks, oil refineries, banking systems. The flags still flew over the government buildings, but the productive capacity of the nation increasingly belonged to foreign shareholders. The pattern repeated across the developing world with remarkable consistency. In Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, the same playbook was applied decade after decade. A government would borrow dollars from international banks to build roads, dams, power plants, or factories. The projects would generate revenue in local currency, but the debt had to be repaid in dollars. When commodity prices fell on international markets, or when global interest rates rose at the Federal Reserve's discretion, the country could not earn enough dollars to service its debt. It would go to the IMF, which would provide a bridge loan to prevent immediate default. In exchange, the country would submit to structural adjustment. Think about the psychology of this system carefully. A nation that cannot pay its debts loses its sovereignty in increments, slice by invisible slice. It cannot set its own interest rates, because the IMF has opinions about monetary policy. It cannot protect its own infant industries, because trade liberalization is a condition of the loan. It cannot subsidize food for its poorest citizens, because austerity is required. Every significant economic decision must be approved by creditors sitting in offices in Washington. The finance minister becomes a middle manager, reporting to the IMF staff who visit quarterly to review compliance. The central bank becomes effectively a branch office of the Federal Reserve. By the early 1970s, the system had evolved into something even more powerful and even less constrained. President Richard Nixon, facing a run on American gold reserves as foreign governments began demanding the metal for their paper dollars, made a fateful decision. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The last link between the dollar and any tangible commodity was severed with a brief television address. The Bretton Woods system collapsed overnight, but American dominance did not collapse with it. Instead, something remarkable and counterintuitive happened. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency despite having no gold backing whatsoever. Countries continued to hold dollars in their reserves and price commodities in dollars because there was simply no alternative. The infrastructure of global trade had been built around the dollar for 25 years. This was the birth of what analysts would later call the petrodollar system. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated a secret agreement with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would price all oil sales in US dollars and invest their enormous petroleum revenues in American Treasury bonds. In exchange, America would provide unlimited military protection for the Saudi regime. Every other oil-exporting nation followed the Saudi example. If you wanted to buy oil anywhere in the world, you needed dollars first. The entire global energy market became a permanent subsidy for American financial power. The true nature of the debt weapon was revealed with brutal clarity in the crisis that engulfed the developing world in the 1980s, a catastrophe so profound that economists still call it the lost decade. The tipping point arrived on August 12, 1982, when Mexico's finance minister Jesus Silva Herzog telephoned the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve with devastating news. Mexico could not service its foreign debt. The Treasury was empty. The game was up. The announcement sent shockwaves through the global financial system like an earthquake centered directly beneath Wall Street. American banks, primarily Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America, had lent hundreds of billions of dollars to Mexico, to Brazil, to Argentina, to Venezuela, to dozens of nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The 9 largest American banks had exposure to developing country debt exceeding 300% of their total capital. If these countries defaulted, if they simply refused to pay, the entire American banking system would collapse into insolvency. At the exact same moment, the Federal Reserve under Chairman Paul Volcker had raised American interest rates to historic and unprecedented highs, to combat the inflation that had plagued the 1970s. The prime lending rate reached an astonishing 21.5% in June 1981. This policy was designed to squeeze inflation out of the American economy, and it succeeded brilliantly in that narrow goal. But its effects on debtor nations in the developing world were absolutely catastrophic. Their loans were denominated in dollars with variable interest rates tied to American benchmarks. When rates doubled and tripled at the Federal Reserve's command, so did their debt service payments. Countries that had been managing their obligations suddenly faced mathematical impossibility. In Mexico City, Finance Minister Silva Herzog looked at the ledgers and realized with horrifying clarity that the numbers simply could not work. Oil revenues, which had been Mexico's salvation, had collapsed as global petroleum prices fell. The peso was in freefall against the dollar. Mexico owed over $80 billion to foreign creditors, and it could not pay even the interest, let alone the principal. Silva Herzog boarded a plane to Washington to deliver the news in person. He was not coming to negotiate new terms. He was coming to surrender. The crisis spread like wildfire across the developing world. Within months, Brazil announced similar problems. Argentina followed, Venezuela, Philippines, Nigeria, Poland. By the end of 1983, 27 countries across 3 continents had been forced to reschedule their debts, a diplomatic euphemism for admitting they could not pay. The entire developing world was drowning in dollar-denominated obligations it could never honor. But here is precisely where the debt weapon showed its true power, its elegant brutality. The debtor nations had no leverage whatsoever. They could not simply refuse to pay because refusal would mean being cut off completely from the global financial system. They could not buy oil because oil was priced in dollars. They could not import food because food was traded in dollars. They could not purchase medicines or machine parts or any of the inputs their economies required to function. Default meant not just bankruptcy but civilizational collapse. The solution imposed by Washington was not debt relief. It was more debt, wrapped in more conditions. The IMF provided emergency loans to prevent immediate default and immediate banking crisis in New York, but only if countries agreed to brutal austerity programs. Governments slashed education spending, closing schools and firing teachers. They cut healthcare budgets, closing hospitals and rationing medicines. They eliminated subsidies on food and fuel that kept the poorest citizens alive. They sold state-owned enterprises to foreign buyers at a fraction of their actual value. The banks were rescued. The people were sacrificed. The social consequences were devastating beyond any statistical measure. In Mexico, real wages fell by 40% during the 1980s. Families that had been middle class found themselves in poverty. In Brazil, inflation spiraled completely out of control, reaching over 2,000% annually, wiping out the savings of a generation. In Argentina, the middle class was essentially destroyed, with profound political consequences that echo to this day. An entire generation across Latin America watched their standard of living collapse, their opportunities vanish, their futures foreclose, while the debts continued to compound with mathematical indifference. But the creditors, sitting in their offices in New York and Washington and London, had a different idea entirely. They did not want traditional military conquest, which was expensive and politically complicated in the post-colonial era. They had a much smarter, much more elegant approach. In October 1985, Treasury Secretary James Baker announced what became known as the Baker Plan. This new approach acknowledged with apparent sympathy that debtor nations simply could not repay their loans in full, at least not on the original schedule. The numbers made that obvious to anyone with a calculator. But instead of forgiveness, the Baker Plan offered restructuring. The debts would be extended over longer time periods. Grace periods would be granted on principal payments. New loans would be provided to service old ones, a financial technique indistinguishable from a Ponzi scheme. In exchange for this apparent generosity, countries would deepen their structural reforms. They would privatize more aggressively. They would liberalize more completely. They would open their economies more thoroughly to American investment and American goods. This was the true genius of the debt weapon, the insight that elevated it above crude military power. It never demanded immediate payment, because immediate payment was mathematically impossible and everyone knew it. Instead, it demanded permanent compliance, perpetual subordination, endless reform in directions that always seemed to benefit creditors. A country in debt was a country under control. A country trying to escape debt was a country that could be disciplined. The debt was not a bug in the system that needed to be fixed. It was the central feature, the mechanism of control that made everything else possible. By 1989, the approach evolved further still with the Brady Plan, named after Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady. This new architecture allowed countries to convert their bank loans into tradable securities called Brady bonds. These bonds were backed by U.S. Treasury collateral, which meant they could be sold on secondary markets. It sounded like relief for the debtor countries. It was actually a brilliant mechanism to transfer risk from American banks, which were dangerously exposed, to the diffuse global market while maintaining all the underlying debt obligations. The debts did not disappear. They were merely redistributed and made more liquid. Consider how this system worked in the daily lives of ordinary people. If a fisherman caught a fish in the waters off Peru, a portion of the profit from selling that fish ultimately flowed through currency exchanges and debt service payments to creditors in New York. If a farmer grew coffee in the highlands of Colombia, the revenue flowed through the same maze of obligations until a fraction ended up in American financial institutions. If a factory worker assembled electronics in a Malaysian export zone, the factory itself was likely owned by investors who had purchased it during a debt-induced privatization at a steep discount. The extraction was invisible to those who suffered it, but it was relentless and systematic. Between 1982 and 2000, developing countries transferred over $4 trillion in debt service payments to creditors in the developed world. Read that figure again. $4 trillion flowed from poor nations to rich ones, from the hungry to the well-fed, from those who needed schools to those who owned banks. This was not aid flowing from rich to poor, as the Marshall Plan had been presented. This was tribute flowing from poor to rich, extracted through the machinery of debt and enforced by the threat of financial exclusion. The Marshall Plan had provided $12 billion to Europe over 4 years and been celebrated as unprecedented generosity. The debt system extracted hundreds of billions from the developing world every single year and was called normal. The consequences extended far beyond economics into the political sovereignty of nations. Countries that had won formal political independence from colonial powers in the 1950s and 1960s discovered that they had never achieved genuine financial independence. The ministers of finance became puppet figures, dancing to music composed in Washington. They reigned in their capitals, but the IMF ruled their budgets. National parliaments passed economic legislation that had been pre-approved and sometimes pre-written by creditors and their technical advisors. Democratic elections determined which politician would administer the austerity program, not whether austerity would occur. The most dramatic demonstration of the system's power came with the Asian financial crisis of 1997, which arrived like a hurricane in economies that had been celebrated as miracles. It began in Thailand in July, spread with terrifying speed to Indonesia, South Korea, and Malaysia, and threatened briefly to engulf the entire global economy. These were not poor countries by any measure. South Korea was a manufacturing powerhouse with world-class technology firms. Indonesia was oil-rich and rapidly industrializing, but they had accumulated dollar-denominated debts that became instantly unpayable when their currencies collapsed against the dollar. The IMF demanded massive structural reforms in exchange for bailout loans. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia called it publicly what it was, a new and more sophisticated form of colonialism. He was not wrong. In Indonesia, the crisis led to riots in the streets of Jakarta, the fall of the Suharto government after 32 years in power, and social upheaval that killed over 1,000 people. In South Korea, corporations that had been family-owned for generations, the chaebols that represented Korean economic pride, were broken up and sold to foreign investors as conditions of the IMF program. The national humiliation was so profound and so deeply felt that ordinary citizens donated their personal gold jewelry to the government to help pay off the foreign debt. They called it the Gold Collection Campaign. Think carefully about that image. An entire nation pawning its wedding rings, its heirlooms, its physical memories of love and family to satisfy foreign creditors who demanded payment. The final payment on many of these obligations has never been made. Some of these debts will never be fully repaid. They continue to compound year after year, decade after decade, a perpetual mortgage on national futures. Today, developing nations collectively owe over $11 trillion in external debt, a number so large it has become almost meaningless to the human mind. The debt service payments consume resources that could build schools where children might learn, hospitals where the sick might heal, and clean water systems that would prevent the deaths of infants. The mechanism that was designed at Bretton Woods in 1944 continues to operate with ruthless efficiency in 2024. The story of American debt diplomacy is the ultimate lesson in the power of financial architecture, the way that technical arrangements presented as neutral can reshape the destiny of nations. The architects of the post-war system understood something that their successors have never forgotten. Military empires are expensive and politically fragile. They require soldiers who might be killed and ships that might be sunk and constant vigilance against guerrilla resistance. But financial empires are self-sustaining and nearly invisible. Once a country is thoroughly enmeshed in the dollar system, it cannot escape without destroying its own economy. The bars of the cage are made of spreadsheets, and the prisoners guard themselves. The nations trapped in this system believed they could borrow their way to prosperity. They did not realize that every loan was a link in a chain being forged around their sovereignty. They did not understand that the interest payments would consume their futures before those futures could even arrive. The creditors proved definitively that the most effective way to control a country is not to invade it with armies that might face resistance, but simply to lend to it with conditions that cannot be refused. But the history of the debt weapon teaches us that systems built on extraction eventually generate resistance. China now offers alternative lending through the Belt and Road Initiative, without the ideological conditions attached to Western loans. Russia and Iran trade increasingly in currencies outside the dollar system. The BRICS nations discuss creating institutions that might someday rival the IMF. When the world watches nations struggle under crushing debt obligations, remember the architects who designed this system in a mountain resort in New Hampshire 80 years ago. Remember that every financial crisis in the developing world is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Remember that debt is never neutral. It is always a relationship of power. The flags hanging in the IMF headquarters today represent 190 sovereign nations. It is the symbol of a system that promised development but delivered dependency, that offered partnership but demanded subordination. The delegates who gathered at Bretton Woods believed they were creating a new world order based on genuine cooperation. They were correct. They created an order that cooperates magnificently to extract wealth from the weak and transfer it to the strong, with efficiency that would have astonished any emperor of the ancient world. Financial power is invisible power. If you control the currency, you control the choices. If you own the debt, you own the debtor.